Howdy ho. I thought I would sit down real quick and talk about breastfeeding. Turns out this has not been a quick endeavor because this is my third time filming it. I actually had to ask Scott to take the baby to my parents' house because she keeps ripping my camera and throwing it on the floor. It's fine. I have been promising that I would film a video talking about my breastfeeding journeys for a while now, actually for 2 years, because I planned to do it with my son, and he's over 2.5 now. But since we're at this point, I figured I would just do a combined breastfeeding experience because I have a lot to talk about and I'm very heated. So let's rewind back to 20-year-old Destiny finding out she was pregnant. We got pregnant super fast after trying, literally the first month, and I was so gung-ho ready to breastfeed. My goals were breastfeed for at least 2 years. My baby would never drink a drop of formula, never take a bottle, never touch a pacifier. I was super naive, and I was 100% that mom that thought formula was just evil, and any mom who gave their baby formula was just horrible mom. That's what I was thinking. Little did I know that my baby would have formula within the first 2 weeks of him being born. I was so prepared to breastfeed. I made a Pinterest board full of articles on breastfeeding, how to get the perfect latch, how to keep your supply up. I was ready. I was so excited. Fast forward, about 4 weeks before my due date, I started getting excruciating back labor. I had had back pain through my entire pregnancy, but it was literally horrible. I know now, after having 2 babies and 3 midwives, that I have a super short torso, so when I'm pregnant, my baby gets wedged in a really weird position. That being said, the farther along I got, he started getting pushed down more and more and more, and he was just very wonky when he was inside of me. That sounds weird. And I was just getting progressively worse. So for about 3 weeks before I gave birth, I didn't sleep at all. I was up all night crying, having panic attacks. I was in so much pain, and I was absolutely terrified because I was having a home birth and I wasn't getting any sleep, and I was worried that I wasn't going to be able to do it. Eventually my waters broke and I wasn't dilating, literally at all. So my midwife suggested we go to the hospital, and she kept throwing around the phrase, "You're probably going to have a C-section." A few of the nurses told me this as well. So after about 24 hours of my waters being broken, I had dilated maybe 2 centimeters, and things were just not going well for me. So they gave me an epidural, I got Pitocin, I had antibiotics because there was a lot of stuff going on. I'm gonna film a separate video talking about my labor and delivery stories, but it was a lot going on. Eventually, he was born. I was able to give birth vaginally, and they put him on my chest. I was feeling very defeated that I wasn't able to have a successful home birth, and I really just didn't want to touch my baby at this point. So immediately after they put him on my chest, I said, "Can my husband take him?" I was so exhausted because I hadn't slept for weeks, and I just honestly didn't want to be anywhere near my baby. So I kept asking, "Can Scott take him? Can Scott take him?" And they said, "No, super important, the baby has to be on you for the first hour, and you need to get him to latch." So even though I really didn't want to, I tried to get him to latch on, and he just wasn't interested. And again, I had spent 9 months researching breastfeeding, and although I'm obviously not a lactation consultant, I felt like I kind of knew that something was wrong at this point because he wasn't doing any of the things that a newborn is supposed to do when they're trying to nurse. All the doctors and nurses kept just assuring me that sometimes when a baby's had a traumatic, really hard birth, they just aren't really interested in nursing for the first day. I thought this was kind of weird, but again, brand new mom, super overwhelmed, I just went with it. We get put in our new room, and what do they hand me? That dreaded sheet where you're supposed to keep track of how often they're feeding, how long, which side. Hated that piece of paper with both of my babies. Gosh, it's the worst. So I start tracking, and my baby is not nursing. I try to put him on the breast every 2 hours. Again, even though I didn't want to touch him at this point, let alone nurse him. I kept doing it because the doctors and nurses kept bringing it up, pressuring me. So I kept trying to nurse him and things just weren't looking right. Every time I finally got him latched, and he did not want to latch. Every time I finally got him on, he was ripping off, screaming in pain, and he had the weirdest cry. That is one of the things that is just ingrained in my brain. I don't remember much of him as a baby, but I just remember how weird his cry was when I would try to nurse him. And he just had this shrill, horrible shriek, and he just didn't want to nurse. And when I finally got him to latch on, I was just crying in pain. It was absolutely horrible. And then he would nurse for 2 minutes, rip off, start screaming again. So I asked for a lactation consultant to come in. She immediately showed me a million different ways to put him on. It was very overwhelming. When she finally got him latched, she said his latch looks perfect. He just isn't really interested in nursing because of how long your labor was. And I was like, oh, okay. So she left me alone with this baby. I mean, my husband and my mom was there, but still, things just weren't going well. And I was literally drowning at this point. So every single time a nurse came in, I asked her to help me get him latched on. I wanted this to work. Even though I didn't want to touch my baby, I still knew that it was extremely important to me that at least one thing went right, because I wanted a home birth, had to transfer to the hospital. Okay, well, I wanted it to be drug-free, had to get an epidural. Well, I didn't want antibiotics, had to get antibiotics. So I needed breastfeeding to work. So every single nurse that came in, I asked, can you please help me get him latched on? And she showed me a million different ways. One nurse would come in and say, you can't hold a baby like this. You need to do a football hold when they're first born. That's the only way you'll get them latched on. The next nurse would come in and say, no, you're doing it wrong. You need to just stroke their cheek to start the sucking reflex. Okay, I would do that. The next nurse would come in and say, no, you can't do that. It confuses them. The next nurse would say, you need to get them totally naked, just on your body, for them to be able to nurse. Okay, I tried that. And every single nurse came in just pushing all these different ways on me, and I was so overwhelmed. I didn't know what the right thing to do was, and I could tell that something was wrong. So the next day I asked, can I get another lactation consultant to come in? She came in, we struggled. At this point, I was literally gushing blood from my nipples, TMI. This is the worst pain I had ever been in, and I had had back labor for 3 weeks before giving birth, and this was worse than any contractions or anything else I had ever experienced. It literally felt like my nipples were on fire, just constantly. So she said, let's try a nipple shield. We put it on. Things felt worse, actually, but she assured me that he was just really confused, and we were still trying to figure things out. So I asked if I could get a pump brought in, and she very much discouraged that and did not want me to pump because she said that it could cause nipple confusion if I gave him a bottle. I said, is there any way you could check for ties? Because I feel like something isn't right. And she said, no, his latch looks perfect. Now, mind you, none of the lactation consultants or nurse at all checked for ties at this point. They just looked at the way he was sucking and assumed everything was fine. But even I, not a nurse or lactation consultant, could look down and tell that he was sucking weird, something was wrong. We were at the hospital for a long time because of all these infections. We were doing tests. So the next day, I said, before I leave, can I see one more lactation consultant? She came in and said, once again, the third lactation consultant to say this, his latch looks perfect, everything is fine. And I felt broken. I felt crushed because every time I tried to nurse him, it would take 20 to 30 minutes to finally get him to latch on because he would just shake his head, screaming. He didn't want to nurse. Finally got him latched on. He'd nurse for 2 minutes. I was crying. I was in so much pain. And then he'd rip off after 2 minutes screaming. I got to the hospital Saturday night. I finally left Tuesday afternoon. I tried to nurse him through the night. Took him to the chiropractor the next morning. The chiropractor said he is having some extreme tummy problems. And I just broke down. I couldn't do it anymore. So I had my mom help me set up a pump, and I started exclusively pumping. And I just felt this instant relief when I attached myself to the pump for that first time, and I thought, I can do this. And if I'm being honest, the biggest reason I felt like I could do this was because I didn't have to touch my baby, because I really wanted nothing to do with him at that point. Scott and my mom were pretty much taking care of him full time after I started pumping. I would almost never touch him. We went to the pediatrician at his 1-week checkup, and I told her I was exclusively pumping, and immediately she told me that that wasn't sustainable. I wasn't going to be able to do it long term, and I needed to start nursing him again as soon as possible. And again, I started to feel really defeated. Went to my chiropractor. The chiropractor told me pretty much the exact same thing, that I wasn't going to be able to exclusively pump for him. It wasn't really an option. If any of you have bottle fed a newborn, you know how different it is than nursing. They could nurse for half an hour, but if you give them a bottle, they could nurse for 2 minutes and suck 2 ounces down. So it's very different. Their stomachs grow a lot faster when they're on the bottle, and I was having a lot of trouble keeping up with him. I was pumping every half an hour trying to make enough milk for him, and we couldn't go anywhere. I literally couldn't leave the house because I knew I would have to pump in about half an hour, and he would start screaming if he didn't have more milk. So at this point, I was having pretty extreme postpartum depression. I asked my mom to go and pick me up some formula, and after he was a little bit over the week old, we gave him his first formula bottle, and I felt so relieved. So I didn't pump it all that night, and I woke up the next morning with a raging fever, and I felt like I was dying. And if any of you know what mastitis is, you know why. I'm gonna be real honest with you. At that point, I didn't even want to be alive, so I didn't take care of my mastitis. I had already felt like a failure because I had gotten antibiotics while I was in labor, and I wasn't going to go to the doctor and get more antibiotics. So I just let my mastitis sit there for about a week. I pumped every few hours. I tried to do hot compresses, and that's pretty much all I did, and I just lay there with a fever for about a week, till eventually my mom booked me an appointment with a lactation consultant. We walked in. She asked if I wanted to try nursing him. I said, no, I don't really want to. So she took the baby, she fed him a bottle, and she was like, just from seeing how he's latching on this bottle, I can tell that something is wrong. So she started checking his mouth, and immediately she goes, he has a really extreme tongue tie and a really extreme lip tie. And on top of that, he has a really extreme overbite, and he has a lot of jaw issues. And I immediately wanted to break down and cry, because at that point I had had 3 lactation consultants and a dozen nurses tell me that his latch was fine, which to me made me feel like I was the problem in our breastfeeding relationship. So hearing that he had all these problems literally made me want to break down and cry. So she told me that I could get his tongue tie and his lip tie revised, but she could pretty much guarantee that he still would not be able to nurse, because his jaw was basically, I don't really know how to explain it, but because of how he was during my labor and how long my labor was, his neck and his jaw got all messed up, and it was going to take weeks and weeks of chiropractic appointments and stretching out his jaw to be able to get him to open his mouth wide enough to latch on. So she actually suggested that we use a preemie nipple so that he had an easier time on the bottle, because he still struggled even latching on a bottle. And so she said, basically, there's pretty much nothing you can do to get him to latch without you being in excruciating pain. And I cannot tell you like how amazing it felt to hear her say that I wasn't the problem, that I wasn't broken, that my son had these issues that weren't my fault. She also helped me with my mastitis. She was like, this is really extreme. You should have gone to a doctor a long time ago. Your nipples are basically gone. And on top of that, you are using the wrong size flange when you pump, which is causing a lot of issues. So with me skipping a bunch of pumps because I was so depressed, I didn't want to get up and pump, using the wrong size flange, having basically infected nipples from my son biting them off, I was in a really rough shape, and I felt like my boobs had died. Most excruciating pain I've ever been in. I set my goal that I was going to try to make it for 8 weeks pumping, and then I was going to wean and be done, and he was just going to be exclusively on formula. Now, something that I should mention is that I don't respond well to a pump. So I would have to sit there and pump for an hour long, and I'd have to do it every 2 to 3 hours. So when we finally went to bed at night, I would put him to bed and pump for an hour. He'd sleep for about an hour to an hour and a half. He'd wake up, I'd feed him a bottle, I'd pump for another hour. He'd sleep for an hour to an hour and a half. So when I say I literally felt like I was dying the first 6 months of his life, I literally felt like I was dying. and I was drowning and I was falling in this pit of postpartum depression, and I literally couldn't leave my house. I basically didn't leave my house at all for the first 4 to 6 months of his life because there was no point. I'd have to just pump and come home in a few hours anyway. And it was the darkest time of my life. So as soon as I fixed my mastitis, I immediately got it on the other side. But this time it was a lot easier to get rid of because I knew what I was doing. I saw it coming. 8 weeks went by and I thought, okay, I've hit my breastfeeding goal. I'm gonna start weaning. And I got mastitis again. I talked to my mom about it and I was like, I really don't want to do this anymore. After having mastitis on both sides, my supply had dropped so much and I was making 13 to 15 ounces a day. So I would have to supplement over half of his bottles with formula. And I just felt like a complete failure. But my mom really encouraged me that I should try to just push it for as long as I could. So I hit 4 months, and at this point I was doing everything I could to get my supply up because we had literally no money, like literally no money, and we couldn't really afford formula. So I was doing a lot of cluster pumping, and that's what I think got my supply up the most, is I would pump to stimulate cluster feeding. So I would pump for 5 minutes, take a 5-minute break, pump for 5 minutes, 5-minute break. I did that for about half an hour, and then I would switch to pumping for 20 minutes, a 20-minute break. Pump for 20 minutes, 20-minute break, and I would do that for 3 hours, twice a day. And eventually I got to the point where at 4 months postpartum, I was making enough milk. I didn't have to supplement anymore. And I was so excited, but I was also getting to the point where I was extremely obsessive about pumping. I couldn't miss a pump because I was afraid my supply would drop. And I kept track to the ounce of how much I was making every day. So if I made an ounce less today than I did yesterday, I would freak out. I was spending so much time researching pumps. I was buying a bunch of pumps even though we didn't have the money to do it because I thought, oh, this pump suction might work better than this one. I was buying supplements to increase my supply. I was gorging myself on oatmeal, and I was buying all these expensive fancy drinks that were guaranteed to increase my supply. It was extremely damaging because I literally measured my self-worth in the amount of ounces I was making every single day. And since for 4 months I wasn't making enough milk for my son, I literally hated myself. And on top of that, my postpartum depression was becoming all-consuming. When he hit 6 months old, I got mastitis for the 4th time, and I knew that I just couldn't do this to myself anymore. I really wanted to make it to at least a year. My goal for breastfeeding was 2 years, but I just knew that I wasn't myself, and to be the best mom that I could, I needed to let go of this. So I slowly started weaning. I would drop a pump every 2 weeks, and I would slowly do that by pushing my pumps every half an hour. So instead of pumping every 2 hours, I'd push it to every 2.5 hours, then every 3 hours, till eventually I got down to just 1 or 2 pumps a day. And a week after he turned 8 months old, I stopped pumping completely. But at that point, I had saved up enough milk to where I could give him a 4-ounce bottle every day till a little bit after he was 1, and that was really my goal because it takes only 3 to 4 ounces of breast milk for a baby to get all the antibodies they need. Exclusively pumping is the hardest thing I have ever done. And it feels kind of stupid saying that because I only did it for 8 months. And I have seen moms who have done it for 2+ years. And I really wish that could have been me, but I just couldn't because I was devoting 8+ hours every single day attached to my pump. I wasn't sleeping and I felt like a zombie. And on top of that, I kept getting mastitis. It was time for me to stop. Something I didn't mention is that my son has really extreme allergies. So if you don't know us, we're a vegan family, which means we do consume some soy. When he was about 3 weeks old, he started having these really scary reactions where he would literally start like seizing up in his crib. I remember I woke up one night and he was laying next to me and it looked like he was just having a seizure. He was spitting up, he was choking on everything, and he couldn't breathe. Wow, I can't even talk about this. It was the most traumatizing thing I've ever been through, and it kept happening. And I thought my baby was gonna choke to death. I don't say this lightly, but I have PTSD from these situations. And now having Winnie, when she was first born, every time she spit up, I would have a full-blown panic attack because I thought she was going to choke to death, like he almost did multiple times. We took him to the chiropractor, and it turns out that he was having really extreme reactions to soy, gluten. He was lactose intolerant. He was allergic to pretty much everything in my diet. And it was really frustrating because his reactions were so severe that I had to pump and dump for 2 weeks and go on an elimination diet. Now, I am the pickiest eater in the world, so having to cut out gluten, soy, on top of being vegan, I was literally starving myself for about a month. And on top of that, I was just dumping all the milk that I had pumped down the drain. I was giving him some milk baths, but I just didn't really see a point in freezing all this milk, so I would just dump it down the drain. I have never felt so guilty as seeing my baby almost choke to death because of something I ate. It was a really hard time. I feel guilty saying this, but the first 4 to 6 months of my son's life was the worst time period I've ever been through. And most of it was due to breastfeeding. So you can imagine why when I finally got pregnant for the second time, I didn't want to breastfeed my baby at all, because I was actually traumatized from my experience and the lack of support I felt. I found the most amazing midwife. I love her to death. I think about her every single day. And immediately I told her that I wasn't planning on breastfeeding this baby. And she was so incredibly kind and supportive. Obviously, she wanted me to breastfeed. It kind of goes hand in hand with being a midwife and doing a home birth that most women want to breastfeed. And I was just pretty adamant about the fact that I would nurse her in the hospital to make sure she got my colostrum, and then I was done, because I just couldn't handle getting mastitis again. A lot of the problems that he had with latching were genetic, that I knew that she would have too, and I just couldn't put myself through exclusively pumping again, especially not while having 2 kids this time. So she suggested that we just wait till she was born and we'll just see what happens. So I have another very traumatic and hard birth. I plan for a home birth again. I'm transferred once again to the hospital. She's born, I barely make it to the hospital before she's born this time, so I was fortunate enough that I didn't have an epidural. It was drug-free, which is what my goal was. They put her on my chest and they say, let's try nursing her, and immediately she latched on. I could tell that things were different immediately. It's so weird looking back on my first breastfeeding experience and knowing from the moment I tried to latch him for the first time that something was wrong, and then putting her on and it being completely different, and she just latched on and stayed latched for half an hour, literally the moment she was born. So they bring us to the recovery room. My midwife stays with me. After the baby is done nursing, I hand her to her because, again, like, my midwife is just an incredible person. I miss her so much. And she checks her for me, and of course, she has a tongue tie and a lip tie. Not quite as extreme, but it's definitely still there. So I keep nursing her. She's cluster feeding. And the pediatrician comes in, and I said, you know, can you talk to my midwife? And my midwife tells her that she has a tongue tie and a lip tie. My first baby had one also, and I really wanted to get it revised this time as soon as possible so that if I want to breastfeed, it'll be more successful. The pediatrician checks her and says, yep, she certainly does. She has a tongue tie and a lip tie. I'll get you that referral before you leave. I start nursing her. Every few hours, I keep track on that dreaded piece of paper, and I start to get in excruciating pain. Literally horrible. I have been through a lot of pain, but I can tell you that there is nothing worse than nursing a baby with a tongue or lip tie. Horrible. I remember texting my friend Kylie. Kylie, if you're watching this, literally panicking because I didn't want to breastfeed and I'm in so much pain. And I kept telling the nurses she has a tongue tie and a lip tie. And all the nurses kept saying, her latch looks fine. And I was like, you're not even checking her. I've had my midwife and the pediatrician at the hospital check, and I know she has a tie. And I just felt like the nurses thought I was so stupid because I kept saying she had these ties, and the nurses just kept blowing me off. And I said, can I get a pump, please? Because I'm already in excruciating pain. I'm already starting to bleed. It hasn't even been a full day, and I need a break. And I don't want to get mastitis. Like, that was my biggest fear at this point. And they were really discouraging, and they didn't want me to get a pump. So the next day I say, can I please see a lactation consultant for some help because I'm dying here. They send the lactation consultant in. I latch my baby on. She looks at me and she says, her latch is perfect. And I said, well, I actually know she has a tongue or a lip tie. And she goes, no, I don't think she does. I said, ma'am, my midwife was already in here. and the pediatrician, they both checked her mouth and she has ties. And she goes, you know, I really don't think she does. Her latch looks pretty perfect. Here's a better way to adjust her. Call me if you need me again. And then she left. And I have never in my life felt so angry as I did in that moment. And I felt so unsupported. It was blowing my mind. And I remember just texting my friend, feeling so helpless. Because here I am, trying to do what I felt like was best for my baby, trying to breastfeed her, literally bleeding, having scabs on my nipples, and the lactation consultant leaving, saying, everything's fine. So that night I finally say, can I please get a pump? And the nurse said, you know, you really don't want to introduce a bottle this soon. And I was like, I exclusively pumped with my son. Can I please have a pump? They bring in a pump. They try to teach me how to use it. And at this point, I am just really aggravated. And I was probably mean, but I was like, I know what I'm doing. Please leave. So I started pumping, and I pumped so much colostrum. I wanted to cry. After having a low supply, it was just like the little boost that I needed to keep trying, because I pumped so much. Even the nurse came in and was like, I have never seen a mom pump this much colostrum. And I was like, thank you. Anyways, she started taking a bottle, and I was doing it every other feed. I had to stay in the hospital a few days again because of issues with the birth. I was doing every other feed where I would nurse her, then I would give her a bottle just to try to heal my nipples. I was using ice packs. They gave me all this stuff, and it just wasn't helping because of course she had ties. The next morning I woke up and they said, you get to leave today. And I said, can I see another lactation consultant, please? Because I really need to get this tongue tie revised. I am in so much pain. And of course that same lady came in and was like, I really don't think she has a tie. And I said, okay, well, can I please still have a referral? And she said, okay, well, just so you know, referrals are about 30 days out. And I, at that point, just wanted to cry. How do you expect a mother to successfully breastfeed when it takes a month to get an appointment to get their tongue or lip tie revised? That makes literally no sense to me, because I was in that hospital for 48 hours and my nipples were basically completely gone at that point. So can you imagine if I would have continued on for a month? Can you imagine? And the lack of support, me coming in knowing that my baby has a tie, and the lactation consultant basically brushing me off and saying, no, you're wrong, she doesn't. I just can't even tell you how angry I was. We were getting ready to leave, and the original pediatrician that checked her the first time came in, and I was done. I think she could tell that I was losing it. And I was like, the lactation consultant keeps telling me she doesn't have a tongue or a lip tie, and they're telling me it's gonna take a month before I can get an appointment for this to be revised. So I just know I can't do this anymore. And she looks at me and she goes, I'm just gonna revise it for you real quick. I literally want to cry right now thinking about that, because if it hadn't been for that pediatrician seeing how important this was to me, I would not be breastfeeding at this moment, because I was not going to nurse a baby with a tongue tie for a month. And I wasn't going to put myself through exclusively pumping again. So right there in the hospital room, she clipped her tongue tie. And she said, I don't think the lip tie is going to give you much of a problem, but if you need to, you can get that revised at a later date. It took a while for me to heal after that. I think it took a full 2 weeks for my nipples to heal. Because let me tell you, you guys, I don't want to be that person that tells you like, oh, this is harder than this, or this is harder than this. But if you have nursed a newborn with ties, you know how crushing it is. I would literally cry every time she woke up, because I knew I was going to have to feed her and I was going to just be in that excruciating pain. But again, I had the most amazing midwife, and she supported me so much, and so did my mom, and so did Scott. The only way I was able to get everything to heal was I used these silver cups. I'd wear them when she wasn't nursing. I'd nurse her on one side, then I'd use a haka, and I'd give her a bottle. So each side was getting a break for several hours, because I would nurse her on this side, use a haka while I was nursing her, give her that bottle. Then I would nurse her on the next side. Then when she was hungry again, I'd give her the next bottle. So it took about 2 weeks and everything was fully healed, and we were breastfeeding. And I love breastfeeding. It's one of my favorite things I've ever experienced. I love every minute. I love every single time I pick her up to nurse her, even when she bites me. It is so extremely special. And I get a lot of questions from people asking when we're gonna stop. And this isn't a very popular opinion, but we'll stop when I'm ready to stop. And I know a lot of people tend to go off of their kids, but this has been one of the most precious things I've ever experienced, and I want to always remember it that way. I never want to look back and think of the moments I dreaded nursing, feeling trapped, because these past 10 months, apart from the first 2 weeks, have been wonderful. And people always ask me for help with breastfeeding, and I would love to help. I really would. And no one believes me when I say you need to find a good lactation consultant, or you need to find a good doula, or you just need to find somebody that believes you and supports you. But I went through so many lactation consultants, and I have only found one that made a difference in my life. Maybe the lactation support at your hospital is better than mine, but I felt so small whenever I saw them. So small and so worthless, like they really didn't care about how I was feeling. And I like to keep breastfeeding pretty private. And it's not because I'm shy or I don't like to nurse in public, because I do. I just have to. I post a lot of pictures and videos of me breastfeeding in public on my stories, but it's the moments where it's just me and her, where we go and we sit somewhere in a dark room alone, that are just the moments I'll never forget. And I love every minute that I get to breastfeed. And both of my breastfeeding journeys have been so extremely different, and they are still both some of my proudest accomplishments. So, yeah. Thanks for watching.